Would you be okay with your pilots experimenting in the cockpit? Maybe trying out things they don't normally do, or just checking how the aircraft systems really work? Well, it turns out that this does happen, and in this video I will show you why that might not always be a great idea. On the 28th of March 2017, an Air France crew was getting ready to operate their last flight of the day out of Paris-Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, France. The weather was generally clear with only some light winds, and the upcoming flight was going to take them over to Zurich in Switzerland, where they would then finish their day with a nice night stop. The captain was 51 years old and had been flying for Air France since 1999. His colleague, the first officer, was 36 years old and had been working with Air France since 2008, where he had started off directly on the Airbus A320. This meant that both pilots were very experienced on the type and therefore also quite comfortable with it. But being comfortable doesn't always mean knowing everything, as we will soon see. Now, another important detail in this story is that these two pilots had flown a lot with each other and they were very good friends. They had actually even told Air France's rostering department that they preferred flying together whenever possible, and since that was perfectly okay from the airline's point of view, the rosters had done what they could to accommodate this. You see, being very familiar with someone has both positive and negative consequences when it comes to a hierarchic environment. It can be super positive, because the pilots will know each other and know how they will react to various situations very intimately. And on top of that, it's likely that the operational part of the work will run super smoothly, just because the pilots enjoy each other's company and will do everything they can to facilitate a good day. But the flip side is a filing down of the authority gradient, which is required in a cockpit, especially when things start to go wrong. So, in a situation where you are the manager, or the captain in this case, being close friends with a subordinate can lead to some quite awkward situations. So once the briefing was complete, the two pilots finished up their checklists, the cabin crew closed the doors, and soon the aircraft was pushed back from its gate and started taxiing out towards its departure from runway 27 left. The initial part of the takeoff proceeded completely normally, and the first officer soon rotated and started pitching up to hold the normal speed. But like I explained earlier, they were now flying with way more thrust than they actually needed, so he soon found himself also having to pitch up more than he normally would. The flight director stopped indicating higher at 18 degrees, for the reason that I explained before, but with that pitch the speed just kept rising, so the first officer therefore continued to pitch up outside of his flight director, in order to still keep that speed of V2 plus 10, which he was used to. 5 seconds after takeoff, the pitch was therefore at 19.7 degrees, and the speed reached a maximum of 147 knots. Now that's higher than the speed they wanted, but still well inside of the normal speed envelope, and far away from any maximum speeds for the flaps. But the first officer still continued to pitch up. 6 seconds later, the attitude had reached 24.6 degrees, with the first officer still inputting 11.7 degrees pitch up on his side stick, and here, another feature of the Airbus's fly-by-wire system now kicked in. It turns out that if the pilot's side stick is deflected to more than 14 degrees backstick, and one of the two protections, nose up attitude or angle of attack, is also active, well then the alpha floor will also activate. And since those criteria were now met due to the high nose attitude and backstick input, the aircraft momentarily went into alpha floor protection. The way this would have been shown to the pilots was primarily by an annunciation on their flight mode annunciator on their primary flight display. The pitch increase would then have also been stopped at the current value until a further nose-up input would have been made, and the thrust would have gone into full toga mode with toga lock shown on the FMA. In this case, the alpha floor protection only activated for about half a second, so the pilots likely never saw it, but the toga lock would stay engaged until the pilots disengaged the outer thrust, selected climb thrust, and then re-engaged it again. And in this case, the thrust was already in toga, since the pilots had taken off with full thrust, and that meant that there wouldn't have been any noticeable change in the thrust. About 13 seconds after the activation of the alpha floor, the first officer disengaged the outer thrust using the outer thrust disconnect switches on the thrust levels, and 8 seconds later he then re-engaged it again, using the button on the glare shield in combination with moving the thrust levers into the climb detent. This reset the system, and the pilots then continued to accelerate the aircraft, retract the flaps according to the schedule, and then continued their climb up towards their cruising level without anything else happening. Air France Flight 1414 landed safely on Zurich runway 06 and then taxied into the terminal. Now this was obviously not a big deal, right? Our system had activated and given the pilot some strange indications, but the safety of the flight was never really in jeopardy. That's all correct, but for any pilot worth their salt, they would never be happy about the aircraft doing something that they just didn't understand. Part of our job is to always maintain situational awareness, which includes everything, including technical situational awareness. So these two pilots now really wanted to figure out what it was that they had experienced. Anyway, after they had shut down the aircraft on the stand in Zurich and all of the passengers had disembarked, the first officer received a call from the Air France operations control who asked if he would be willing to conduct what's known as a ferry flight 2 days later between Toulouse and Paris. A ferry flight is when an empty aircraft needs to be moved without passengers from one airport to another, and given that this was from Toulouse, the home of Airbus, it was likely after some kind of maintenance, but the final report didn't really specify that. The first officer agreed, but he also asked if the company had selected a captain for the flight yet, and when the ops controller said no, he asked his friend, the captain, if he would be interested in doing this flight together with him. The captain agreed, and the first officer therefore suggested this to operations, who also thought that this would be a great idea. So this meant that the same flight crew would now be flying together again with an empty aircraft just 2 days later. Fast forward to the 30th of March, and the pilots were now in the crew room in Toulouse preparing for their ferry flight over to Paris. The weather was once again quite nice, with only some few clouds at 10,000 feet, and there were no NOTAMs or technical issues recorded on the aircraft. This time they would be flying a beautiful Airbus A321, which is a significantly bigger aircraft than the baby bus Airbus A318 that they had flown on the days before. So when the pilots had walked out to the aircraft and verified its technical status, the captain, who was now going to be pilot flying, briefed the first officer about this and said that they would limit the initial rotation to 7.5 degrees. But he also added that this would be the chance they had to try to recreate that strange indication that they had experienced on the flight before. So in order to do that, he decided that they should also, once again, execute a full thrust takeoff, this time with a completely empty aircraft. Now, from a procedural standpoint, there are no differences between how we pilots should handle a ferry flight from a normal passenger flight. There are some extra steps we have to do. Since there are no cabin crew on board, the pilots will have to close and arm the doors, for example, and we also have to secure the galleys to make sure that no trolleys will come shooting down the aisle during landing, which actually has happened. But apart from that, the procedures and rules stays exactly the same. In any case, the pilots had soon completed their pre-flight and therefore started taxiing out towards the holding point for runway 14 left, this time with call sign Air France 372 Victor. Once the before takeoff checklist had been completed, the first officer advised Toulouse Tower that they were ready for departure, and they were subsequently cleared for takeoff from runway 14 left with only mild winds reported. So at time 17:52, the captain moved the aircraft into position, stabilized the engines, and then moved the 2 thrust levers into the TOGA detent. And that now caused a completely empty aircraft to literally jump into action and quickly accelerate down the runway. The captain then carefully rotated, even though with this weight and thrust it would have been quite hard to actually tail strike it, but he then continued to pitch up just like his colleague had done 2 days earlier. Initially, he pitched for 17 degrees, but since the aircraft then kept accelerating to up around 160 knots, he continued pulling back on his side stick until the aircraft was pitching 24 degrees nose up, and his stick deflection was then passing 14 degrees. This caused the aircraft to once again activate the alpha floor protection as the aircraft climbed through around 750 feet, and the engines also again went into TOGA lock. But this time the pilots saw it happen, even though it was only active for less than a second, and they were now a lot quicker to disengage and re-engage the autothrottle again. The aircraft then continued climbing like if nothing had happened up towards their initial climb clearance of flight level 100. Now so far you might not think that this was so bad, and in itself I would agree that the aircraft was never in any real danger here. But the alpha floor protection has been added to the aircraft for a reason, and it's not the pilot's job to try and purposely push the aircraft into situations where its protections are activated. The aircraft just continued to climb and was soon cleared to continue up to flight level 140. As they approached flight level 100, the first officer contacted the next controller frequency and advised them of their current clearance. The controller called the aircraft up and asked, "Air France 372 Victor, what altitude are you crossing at the moment?" And the first officer replied, "Flight level 100, Air France 372 Victor." The controller then continued with, "Did you level off or not?" Likely asking this because the controller are counting on us climbing or descending continuously, so these pilots would have needed a clearance to level off. But in any case, the first officer then replied, "No, we accelerated at flight level 100, Air France 372 Victor, we are climbing now." And seconds later, the aircraft's speed trend started reversing and was instead replaced by an absolutely insane climb rate, shooting up with over 15,000 feet per minute. Now, there is no other word for what the pilots were doing here other than playing around. They intentionally leveled off at flight level 100, but kept the thrust in climb thrust, meaning that the aircraft quickly started to accelerate. They then allowed the acceleration to go all the way up to the aircraft's maximum certified speed of 350 knots before selecting open climb and a new speed of 220 knots. The result of that was that the aircraft started raising its nose and climbed as quickly as it could in order to decelerate back those 130 knots that the pilots had asked for, exchanging kinetic energy for potential. And since it was completely empty, this now led to a climb speed that we normally only see in fighter jets. That's about 40,000 feet, meaning 21,000 feet above Flight 372 Victor's clearance. But because TCAS, the Traffic Collision Avoidance System, is programmed to track all transponders around and activate if something could be a potential collision threat, the TCAS system in this aircraft now activated and alerted its pilots to a potential traffic conflict 25,000 feet below them. The controller, who had seen both the level off and the following extreme climb rate, now quickly called up the aircraft and told them to please reduce your climb rate because you're causing all systems to flash here. What he meant by that was not further elaborated on in the final report, but it is likely that this enormous climb rate, which had caused the other aircraft's TCAS to activate, now also warned the controller of this potential conflict. Or it was just highlighted on his radar screen as something really unusual. The pilots responded to this, and the climb rate was quickly reduced, and after that, the aircraft autopilot successfully captured flight level 190 without any kind of problem or overshoot, and Flight 372 Victor continued climbing normally towards its cruising level. The rest of the flight continued without any further shenanigans, and after 1 hour and 2 minutes, the aircraft landed normally on runway 08 right at Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport and then taxied into its stand. Now, it is unclear if it was the crew who reported this or if these two incidents were highlighted by the company's operational flight data monitoring system, but we do know that the cockpit voice recorder was overwritten, so this report is based on the flight data recorder as well as subsequent interviews held with the two pilots. The conclusion of the report was that even though it's not a bad idea that pilots practice certain maneuvers in the aircraft, it's probably better to use simulators for these kind of things or to utilize the technical support that they had available to them. Now, nothing really dangerous did happen on these flights, but if the same thing would have happened in a more densely trafficked area, the outcome might have been very different. And a later BAA report about a different Air France incident actually used this report as an example of pilots not following standard operating procedures. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt, you are watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.